packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. And welcome to 2025. I know we've had one episode release this year, but this is the first time Drew and I are with you recording in 2025. So we hope you've had a great break. And today we heard you. You spoke, we listened, you want more IPv6 security stuff. So today's guest, we have Ed Horley, who's the co-host of IPv6 Buzz here on Packet Protector, on the Packet Protector Network.
Packet Pushers Network.
The Packet Pushers Network. There's too many PPs. So many PPs. Packet Pushers, Packet Protector. Anyway, so crazy IPv6 dude. He's also the co-founder of a consulting organization called Hexabuild. It does a lot of IPv6 training and consulting. We'll give you links on how to find Ed. I really like this conversation because we kind of pick up, if you guys remember at episode 7, when we kicked off actually really early, episode 7, last year, we talked to Scott Hogue about IPv6 security essentials. So go back and check that out if you didn't get it. And this kind of picks up the conversation. So we're talking to Ed today about everything from, planning and migrations for enterprise. What are those knowledge gaps going from IPv4 to v6? How can we fix those? What are we doing in the world of monitoring, scanning, discovery? How is automation and zero trust playing into IPv6 conversations? What are we doing with vetting out our products from our vendors? So all kinds of fantastic stuff in this episode.
Yeah, we're really excited to have Ed Horley join us. Ed, let's just start easy. If I'm adopting IPv6, do I need to sort of throw out my security strategy and start from scratch, or what do I need to be thinking about?
No, you don't have to do that. I think the most important thing about v6 security is really understanding what your existing v4 model is really well. And if you don't have that well defined, then you're probably going to fail on v6 because one's sort of dependent on the other. v6 security really is just from a principal practice basis, is really just going to look very similar to v4. Your concepts are all going to be identical. You're just dealing with a different networking protocol. And so there's some nuances around getting into the weeds about how the protocols behave themselves, v4 versus v6. But I don't think there's anything specific around how your strategy is necessarily going to change up. There might be a couple things specifically around ICMP and ICMP version 6 that are going to be pretty dramatically different between v4 and v6. And so you're going to have to take that into consideration. That's just a knowledge gap for most people, not understanding that IPv6 has an end-to-end model for path MTU discovery. That we don't really have fragmentation as a thing that happens inside the network on your behalf in IPv6. That does happen in IPv4. And so we have a tendency to block all related ICMP traffic in v4. And in v6, you really can't do that unless you want to go to the lowest common denominator of packet sizing and do 1280 and not take advantage of your jumbo frames inside your network, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that sort of narrow particular use case. But I think in general, your strategy is going to look really, really similar between the two. At least that's my opinion. I don't know if other people want to challenge me on that.
And I hear this all the time. Okay, IPv6 is, the same concepts as IPv4 when it comes to architecture and security, but with different protocols and nuances. But I guess, you work with a lot of organizations and enterprises that are doing this migration. What are some of the biggest, I don't know if hurdles or maybe misconceptions or knowledge gaps that you see in those teams you're working with, or the questions that they're asking kind of coming into the project originally? What are some of those first kind of exploratory discovery questions that are happening?
First and foremost is probably just the lack of knowledge about the protocol, the lowdown layers of v6 itself, how neighbor discovery works, what the replacement for ARP is, and all the sorts of things that are just differences about how the protocol functions. So those are the first things. I'll be honest, all of us forgot that we actually learned v4 the same way. We had to go through that process, learn subnetting, learn how the address space works, learn, all sorts of the, inverse masking. There's all these things that you learned about IPv4. You may not have had a formal course that said, I took an IPv4 TCP/IP course, maybe way back in the day.
I bet everybody listening to this podcast probably did.
Perhaps. But for many people, it's an assumed set of knowledge that sort of goes along the way of learning a basic bit around it. I've found that most people have not taken the equivalent time to learn the same stuff for IPv6. So when you're asking questions, you're usually coming from an area of, I just don't know. I don't have any exposure to it, or my exposure is very limited, or I'm making assumptions that it's behaving the exact same way as IPv4. And that's where usually you get bit, is around those small nuance areas. So We don't have ARP in IPv6. We're using the layer 3 address the way you're supposed to. So we don't have this 2.5 layer shim that fits in there. We're using multicast a lot more. And so there's some neat things that they did with v6 to sort of solve those problems. But if no one sits down and explains them to you, you're not going to just suddenly understand it. You need to take the time to learn it. So
when you're talking about time, what kind of time commitment are we talking about? What's the learning curve? Is this a couple hours with some YouTube videos and some blogs, or a book or a course, or what do you think?
Depends on how sophisticated you want to get with it. For most folks who are already in IT and already know IPv4, probably 4 to 8 hours of time investment in terms of going through intro courses and materials and reading through stuff is probably going to get you far enough along that you're not going to make a mistake and trip over your own shoelaces as you're running down the hall. And I think that's probably the sort of baseline. And if you want to get really into the weeds of understanding the protocol, obviously taking a more advanced course, something with a protocol analyzer, and spending time really understanding how things work is going to be important for security folks, because if you don't understand how some of the packets are actually moving across the wire, sometimes it's a little difficult to solve problems that are security exposures or things that you don't want to necessarily have happen on the network. And there are design changes that were made fundamentally for the v6 protocol that are different than IPv4. So for instance, we don't have broadcasts. That doesn't exist in IPv6. You have a function of multicast, and yes, you can have a multicast group that is all local nodes, FFO2::1 is the all nodes multicast, but it's a multicast address. You're not doing something weird with the subnetting portion to understand that there's a broadcast address on a given network segment. Just understanding that is super useful, right? So, and understanding how that plays out in terms of Ethernet frames, right? So that has to move down onto the Ethernet frame side, and you have to have a multicast Ethernet frame that goes out. And so what does that look like? And understanding how you can trace everything through. So those are the biggest things that usually get the first set of questions outside of like, why the heck is the address space so big? And
why did we skip 5?
Yeah, why did we skip 5? Yes, that's a real common one.
When organizations are starting down this migration path, are they usually coming in and going, okay, we know we need to do IPv6. Let's work out a big strategy and a plan, and where do we start? Or is it we have some specific use case need, application requirement, whatever, in a subset of our environment, and they're starting from that more narrow scope?
Every company's slightly different. There's a bunch of folks that are obviously doing the high-level design, architecture, working their way through, being very programmatic around adoption for IPv6 or transition to IPv6. Depends on where you fit in sort of the language side. But they think systematically. They probably have a program management team that knows how to implement large-scale IT infrastructure projects, and they have a team that understands how to break that down. And then you have the panic button on the other side, which is someone who needs to get something done. Usually within like a day. Like I've literally had folks call us up and like, we have to get this done like, tomorrow because we have this sort of thing. And I'm like, oh, good luck. I'm not available. So, good luck. But yeah, that's usually the two modes that seem to come through the door. I would say it's a little bit rare that someone comes in with a particular, forced application use case of v6 only. There are some exceptions. They usually fit in like some of the IoT space or some of the power grid space, or I would say the most common is actually the product manufacturers that come and they're like, oh, we have to be able to put v6 in our product in order to meet a government mandate requirement or to meet a compliance requirement. And so they're trying to figure out how to engineer a solution to build into their product to be conformant to do v6. I would say that would probably be the more common one. We've had a bunch of discussion with the customers around that. And I think that one's sort of fascinating because you get to sort of look behind the curtain a little bit and be like, oh, well, you should really look at adding these features to your product because it'll make things better. And so getting a chance to sort of be on both sides of it is sort of a unique opportunity. But that would be the sort of one case where you're doing something where they're coming in very specific, looking to solve a very specific use case around v6.
Does it tend to be driven by the networking team, the security team, architecture team?
I would say the default is obviously the network team is involved with IPv6. That's where it usually lands first. The security team is doing their default, which is always saying, no, we're not going to learn this. We're not going to implement this. We already have enough on our plate.
Hey, now. Hey.
Hey, I'm just telling you what I experienced. This is just my experience. This is my personal experience. It's just me. So, but yeah, the most common answer we get from security teams is no, we don't want to implement that. And it simply just has to do with they usually have too much on their plate. They don't have time to do the learning. There's not a structured environment for them to learn in. And they have a lot of responsibility in terms of liability and other issues. And so their default answer is going to be no. That's shocker.
Right.
That's not shocking.
It is a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot.
For any team or an organization. If you're making kind of a wholesale either uplift or you're running dual stack and you're implementing this whole other infrastructure on your infrastructure, shoot, even just within IPv4, having to go in and like re-subnet, VLAN, re-IP things is just, even in the devil that right? And you know how everything works and you can automate some of that. It's pretty horrific. So, I totally understand the friction with that. Like mentioned in the intro, we did at the beginning of last year, almost a year ago, I guess, 10 months ago or so, we had Scott Hogue on to kind of talk about, IPv6 security essentials. And my takeaway from that was just because you think you've disabled it doesn't mean it's actually not responding, which was kind of horrifying to me.
Yes.
But are they?
That is the big takeaway. It's there.
Yeah, that's still
not.
sticking with me 10 months later. It's not something that we can just, turn off and forget about and have a blind spot to, but are there things we can do to reduce the friction and make it an easier process? What does that look like?
Yeah, and Scott brought up the good point. That's sort of the latent threat. The latent threat is the fact that IPv6 is on by default, preferred by default. So anything you do, you have to do a tremendous amount of effort to turn it off. And then you have to continue doing that effort to turn it off and then check it all the time to turn it off. By the time you're doing all that effort, you might as well just enable IPv6 and bring it into the camp, right? The camel's nose is already in the tent by that point. So you might as well have it there and acknowledge that the camel's there. So I think that part of it is super important. Just don't have it poop in the tent. That's the hard part. It's the second part.
That's where you make your money, Ed.
That's where I make my money. No one wants to swing that shovel. I think that's the important part, is really understanding that education, getting a good plan and being prescriptive and incremental and not exposing yourself unduly, both via networking and via security and operations, is going to be important things. So being well planned and thinking through that stuff is always a better strategy than trying to just shotgun it and hope that you are doing all the right things. So I think those are the important sort of takeaways about the adoption side. Some organizations can adopt it very quickly because relatively small, the impact footprint is not great. They can take larger maintenance windows, things of that nature. If you're in healthcare and people's lives are on the line for an MRI machine being up, you're probably going to adopt v6 a little slower, and probably the MRI machine isn't even going to have the capability to do IPv6 anyway. So there's different strategies you have to take depending on what your organization does and what its function is. And those are all reasonable. You may have certain situations where you're never going to have v6 go into play. You may have other networks where you'll never have v4 go in play, which is a weird thing to say. But there are absolutely power grid meter systems that are all IPv6 only running Ripple, and they don't see a bit of IPv4. Now, do they have front-end systems that talk v6 to v4 in order for folks to access them? Yeah, absolutely. But those systems don't run v4 at all, and no one knows the wiser. Now, do end users deal with those systems? No, not at all. So that's part of the difference, is what are you building and what's the function of it? I happen to think, long-term dual stack is a lot more work, simply because your network team, your help desk team, your systems team, your storage team, your security team, everyone has to know both protocols and practice both protocols and make sure that they're doing everything right in lockstep for policy enforcement, for compliance, for all the things that they might have to do within your environment. They have to do it twice.
I mean, I think it's hard to just go wholesale into v6 and whole hog into that one.
I agree.
When there are devices, security monitoring applications, whatever, that can't do v6 yet, right? It's a crappy answer, but I think that's where we are with things. And, do you get pushback on like the cost, the overhead, the performance?
So usually not the overhead or performance, unless you're stuck in a situation where dual stack is really going to negatively impact you. And there's a handful of customers we have that absolutely fit in that category, where they've been, robbing Peter to pay Paul in regards to like TCAM allocation. And so they're just like, they're at the edge. They can't support the moment you turn on v6 and put more stuff in TCAM, the whole thing falls over. So yeah, you're obviously not going to run dual stack in those scenarios. And you've got to solve for a different problem, which is probably redesign your network to not have those issues.
Buy a new router, dude.
Yeah, or, hey, let's move to VXLAN EVPN fabric. Let's get our layer 3 topologies working the way we want. Let's maybe get our security policies out of ACLs that are chewed up in TCAM and maybe get them pushed onto, firewall configurations, and get a distributed firewall policy configuration working, and, push security out to the edge a little better. Or, there's other things, workarounds that you can do. But yeah, absolutely, v6 can have a negative impact in certain areas. The cost factor is usually human capital cost time.
Right.
Training and educating people is not cheap. It doesn't matter what technology. I mean, if you're doing zero trust and you want to train everyone on zero trust across the board, it's going to cost you money. Same thing with any net new technology you adopt. You need to retrain all your networking people on EVPN, VXLAN. It's going to cost you money. That's just how it works. Like, that's assumed part of the business. No one thinks about that for V6 because no one went through a formal training on V4. You don't have a budget for V4 training, or at least I haven't run across anyone who has a budget for V4 training. You tell me if you run across someone with a budget for V4 training or for formal like product evaluation. Does your product work with IPv4? We need to evaluate your product for working with IPv4. That's not a thing, right? Like, I think we can all agree that's not a thing that happens. So it becomes a very strange conversation when you go in and say, like, I need to have a product evaluation for IPv6, or I need to have a security evaluation for IPv6, or I need to have, training session for IPv6, and we need to, figure all this stuff out. And there's going to be dollars associated with adopting that set of technology. Well, that's not in the budget because you don't break out your IPv4 training and your IPv4 assessment as a separate budget item. That's not a thing.
And it's always hard when there's training. I think it's hard. Now, as somebody who does vendor neutral training, I live in this world, but watching it from the other side, it feels hard to get training to people that they need when it's vendor neutral. Like, it's easier to go, oh, here, take this Cisco training, this Arista training, this whoever, Juniper training, whatever, because there's some comfort that it's from a vendor maybe, but it's very specific to the vendor and it doesn't necessarily translate with the fundamentals across everything else.
And it's often bundled in as part of the hardware sale of saying, like, buy this fresh new tech, and by the way, we'll give you some training on it. And here you go. And by the way, our default training is in IPv4. Right. So, well, that's the other part of it, right? The vendors need to meet the needs of folks. And some of them are starting to do more and more V6 and more examples of V6 to be able to meet that requirement because, US federal government, India, China, many others now have mandates for IPv6. So what do you do in order to be able to address that? Well, they're starting to address it now. You're seeing that.
One thing that you mentioned was have a good IPv6 address plan before you start this project. Can you put a little more meat on that? What does a good plan look like? What kind of things should I be looking at, thinking about?
Yeah, I guess the first thing you do is you go out and buy Tom's book, Tom Cuffin's book on IPv6 address planning. It'll get you started. And full disclosure, I was one of the technical reviewers for the book. So if there's any errors in the spreadsheet in the back of the book, it's me, not him. But yeah, I think an address plan is really useful because it allows you to sort of step away from the minutia around the protocol itself and start talking about what IPv6 can provide you as a net new resource, as an opportunity. And I think that's really, really useful because you're not constrained in the same way that you are with V4 about having limited resources and always trying to make these small little pieces fit in the right sort of space, which V4 dictates that you have to do, right? We do these weird subnetting things in order to be able to maximize how many addresses we can possibly use out of all the limited address space that we're allocated in IPv4. And that problem doesn't exist in V6 at all. Like a single subnet in V6/64, right, is the current internet squared in a single subnet. There's not even that many Ethernet ports that exist on the planet to fulfill a /64. So you don't have to worry about that. And so what do you solve with an address plan? Well, you solve for things like security. You solve for things like routing. You solve for things like application space or services. And so it really changes the conversation from an architecture standpoint about what you can do. And once you have those sort of more enlightened discussions around what's possible, it gets you out of what we refer to as IPv4 thinking. And IPv4 thinking is that narrow constrained thinking and really being boxed in. And suddenly you can do some more interesting things with IPv6. And the address plan allows you to do that. And being free of that allows you to have some discussions around like things like, okay, maybe I have a geographic IPv6 address plan today. So my address plan is built around that. Do I still want a geographic address plan with IPv6? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what you're doing. Is it easier to have address space that's allocated for security in a very specific fashion so that when I see that particular address space come through, it adds complexity to the routing side? That's okay. But maybe I have a single, address space, contiguous address space that's utilized for security devices across my organization. And I break that down. And so it becomes very easy to isolate from an operational standpoint what's security, what's not, or what's out-of-band management or not, or what's particular device types or not within my network. And I can use my address space in a very liberal way without having to be constrained to be able to perform that function or that service that I run. I can do over-the-top networks very easily because I've got address space to be able to do that. So I can have the flexibility to run over-the-top network address space across my backbone.
So you talked a minute ago about eliminating some of those, almost shim kind of OSI layer 2.5 that we have in IPv4. You've talked about the expanded address space and the flexibility. And you mentioned, the security and granularity with that. So I'm kind of thinking now, as we're getting into zero trust, and I know there's still probably a lot of people listening that are like, zero trust, it's just the middle of the bingo card. It's not a real thing. But
cue the eye roll.
As a security architect, it is a real thing and we are doing it. And if you're not involved in that yet, you probably will be in the next, 2 years or so. So it sounds like there's opportunity here to kind of bust out of the constraints we had in IPv4 and our, subnetting and VLANs and weird, dynamic downloadable ACLs that break everything and don't scale well, and kind of rethink this. So can you speak to that from an IPv6 perspective and what that transition looks like?
Yeah, so the opportunity is really about whether the security teams know enough to be able to leverage all of that. And I think that's the knowledge gap that sort of spoke to earlier. But yes, absolutely. Zero trust and IPv6 actually go pretty well hand in hand in terms of opportunities to be able to address some unique architectures that you could make use of in your security design. And just as an example, you could choose to maybe provide specific address space that has very particular security functions around it and simplify your ACLs that you have to write at the top level for, if you're running centralized firewalls or if you're running distributed firewalls, you want to push a single entry set in. So maybe you have 8,000 sites in your organization, and instead of putting 8,000 ACLs that are pushed out to the edge across the board, which is 8,000 entries that every single packet has to flow through, you get one entry. That's a strategic advantage. Now, the difference is your routing tables will then have 8,000 entries in it for where the distribution of that is. And so your routing might be more complex, but if the security policy advantages play to that, then you can make use of that. The reverse can also be true. You can say like, oh, my security platform can handle 8,000 entries, no problem, but my routing table really can't. So I will summarize in my route table and I'll put the granularity in my security table. And those are the sorts of decisions that you can make. And some of them can be geographic based. Some of them can be application based. You can assign applications to work with particular address space. So you could say like, I have an over the top service that I run, whatever that could be. I mean, IP phones, whatever. And you can run them all in the same address space. And then you can write a single ACL entry that basically says that, 2001 DB8 cafe /48 is all IP phones, or maybe it's a 32, 2001 DB8, /32 is all our IP handsets. And you're writing a single entry and you can write all your voice entries directly in for that one single address space. And you've got, 10 lines of ACL that get distributed everywhere and your life is simple.
Yeah, that sounds nice.
Yeah. So there are trade-offs around this. So this is why you have an architecture discussion, security team, routing team, and you're going back and forth across the table about what are your needs and requirements? What can you support? What can we support? What makes the most sense? Does this help us in some way? Right. I mean, that's the other thing.
And what about the products? Sorry to cut you off there, but I'm like, my mind's going several places here. We talked about routing and routing table and firewalls. So I think there's two questions here, which is there's one component of just simply what are the IPv6 capabilities in the equipment? This always kind of makes me laugh and giggle because IPv6 feels like sex in high school. Everybody's talking about it and nobody's been doing it for years.
I don't know what that says about me.
I remember sitting on, panels for IPv6, 10 plus years ago, right? And through each of those, as we updated things, I came, from a company who sold a lot and integrated into the federal government where, they're leading that initiative in a lot of places. And it was, all of these weird RFI and RFQs and RF everything else is that's, having to list out every single little specific IPv6 feature, functional feature of moving packets, security feature of
extension headers.
Yeah. And it feels like there's not, and again, nobody was doing it, right? So I kind of like let my knowledge totally fall apart. I'm going to have to go read your book and watch some of your podcasts and learn a little more here. But definitely the product support for this. So there's the IPv6 feature capabilities. Like what should we be looking for here? What's like barrier to entry that we need to make sure everything should be doing? And then there's the, you mentioned just the capabilities like the TCAM tables and equivalents of, ARP tables and how much resource, CPU, memory do we have in that? And can it handle the load of what we're going to be pushing to it, whether it's on the route side or the security side? So what are some of the things to look for or what are some common trends that you see as you work with customers that are going through these migrations?
So there's a couple of resources. NIST obviously is providing resources about some bare minimum standards around IPv6. And the US government has set up some test labs, some well-known test lab capabilities for folks to, send their product in to get tested and conform to minimum standards. The problem is that you have to be sort of careful of understanding what those minimum standards are, about whether the thing can just work with an IPv6 address on the interface, but it doesn't actually do anything interesting with it. It just forwards a packet and doesn't do anything else. So you need to understand at least the bare minimum of what you're looking for. But as long as you understand that, you can go in there and make use of some of those testing sites to go ahead and do that. Yeah, it's really pushing on the vendors to be able to talk to them about what their product is or is not supporting. And that's where the knowledge gap comes in again, of really understanding where the protocol fits and how it behaves and what it does and what's important to you. I think the good news is that many of the product manufacturers are realizing, due to a bunch of the requirements, and like you said, the US federal government's really been pushing on this to get more complete, what I would call feature parity. So there's a difference between functional parity and feature parity. And feature parity is becoming a much higher goal for many of the product manufacturers to go ahead and meet. The reality is you're still going to have to test. I recommend everyone does a proof of concept lab to test and validate what the product is doing. Stuff is changing still very, very quickly. There's actually a lot of activity in the IETF around sort of protocol standards and what's going on to try and address some of the gaps that are going on in the market today. So you're going to see changes that are happening even for things like trying to fix ULA and other stuff that's going on as active conversations within the IETF. So the reality is you have to hold your vendor's feet to the fire. You have to know enough to be able to understand and articulate what your needs are. But that's true with IPv4 too. And just everyone assumes that you have that knowledge. They don't really challenge around any of that, right? And the default is that they're obviously developing an IPv4. But the reality is that v6 is going to be a bit of a laggard in regards to many feature parity requirements. May not operate the same. May not have the same capacity, right? It might be running software versus hardware. That's probably more of a 2010 to 11 problem than a current problem today. But the reality is that most of the hardware, ASICs, everything else support v6 very well today. So you're really not probably going to run into that problem. It's more of a, do they turn the feature on for you? It's just doing your homework. I mean, I hate to say it, but that's true with everything. You have to do your homework with all of that. And that's just going to be something you have to deal with. But I would start with the NIST standards. It's a good place to sort of start. They have some community strings that define how you do everything within IPv6 for IPv4 too, but for IPv6 specifically. And you can use that to be able to then specify what you want your products to support and then put that out there and say like, hey, my product needs to support these sets of capabilities.
So like if I'm in a room with my friendly sales rep and they're like, yep, we got IPv6 support, I can pull out these NIST documents and be like, okay, let's walk through this and actually dig into that.
Yeah, I don't know if I would walk through in a meeting. I'm sure I might send them the spreadsheet with all the community string requirements and say like, hey, go talk with your folks and make sure that you can get this stuff done. I don't think that's a sit across the table. Everyone's going to say, yes, they support v6 in a product meeting. Right. They're there for sales. Their job is to say yes. That's how it works. Even products that have absolutely zero v6 support, they will nod their head and say yes. And then they'll go back to the development team and tell them they need to go develop IPv6 for the product. So that's going to be your cycle. And if you're a big enough account, you can probably get them to do that. The likelihood that you're going to do that, you work with a sales engineer or an actual SE who's, solution engineer who can walk through the details and figure out what you're trying to do and then actually stand something up for you in a proof of concept lab is probably your best bet to know whether it's going to work or not. Have them do the work. Like, there's no reason you should have to do all of it, right? They should be able to play around. That's how they're going to learn it. So they'll do better for their next customer.
What kind of misconfigurations, maybe specifically that might manifest as a security risk or vulnerability in an organization related to v6 do you see? So I think Scott's answer to this was just thinking you've disabled it, but it's not really disabled. And then, it's still processing those requests at the interface. What else happens?
Yeah, at a broad level, that's true. I would say at the bigger level, let's do the reverse on the high level architecture, more like service provider, big companies. The biggest one is the reality is you're using all global unicast address space. That means it's all routable on the public internet. It doesn't mean you have to route it. And so I would say the biggest mistake is if you choose to take a portion of your address space that you're only going to run internally for maybe out-of-band management, and there's no reason that you need to have that exposed to the greater internet at all, making sure that your policy enforcement, your route policy, your actual routing and everything reflects that. And then someone making a fat finger for route summarization that suddenly advertises that stuff out the way that you don't want it, and you don't have the right security rules in place to sort of block the traffic coming inbound. And so suddenly your out-of-band management system is out on the internet and accessible would probably be like some of the sorts of structural mistakes that you see people make. And so there's strategies to sort of make things easier that way in terms of breaking down your address space itself so that you don't mess that up later. So there's specific ways within your address plan, back to your address plan.
Yeah, that would be a resume generating event right there, I do believe.
Yeah, but the V4 community takes great solace in the fact that somehow we have RFC 1918 and we hide behind address translation to sort of solve that related problem for us, right? And there's some truth to security by obscurity to a certain degree, but I think well architected probably will beat out security by obscurity over the long run, just in terms of good network hygiene as it would be. And taking a security strategy that has that in mind is probably a better bet, but it's not a guarantee. And so you can absolutely have someone junior make a mistake in that particular area, may not know what the difference between a /48, a /40, a /44, or whatever else, and fat finger that or not understand what they're really typing in. And you could end up with a mistake like that. But that's back to, did you educate? Did you teach them? Is it really their fault, or is it really the organization's fault for not doing the right knowledge transfer to make them better at what they're doing?
Do you see changes in some of the monitoring, whether it's on the networking team side and like a NOC or the security team and a SOC? When we get to IPv6, do you see like a revamp of what we're monitoring and alerting on?
Yeah, there's a huge strategy change. And I think Scott brought this up when he talked to you, which is you can't scan a /64, right? You do the math about how long it's going to take you to scan it. So you need to have other ways of gleaning information from the network. And there's some techniques to do that. And being able to query network devices for their neighbor discovery table is a great way to do that, because they absolutely know what's on the wire because it's plugged into them, right? Either wireless or wired, it doesn't matter either way. The strategy is the same. But I think a lot of V4 is moving this way from a telemetry basis anyway, right? Because folks are trying to hide devices within networks. They're trying to infiltrate that way, and knowing what's on the wire directly from the network devices that are running the network is far more useful than trying to scan a network and hope that someone was dumb and left ICMP open on a particular device. That's not a great strategy. So I think those align usually, but my default answer is there's a lot of companies still that think that they can scan a /64 in a reasonable period of time. And I have to do the math for them on the board to show them,
Oh, that's a lot of commas and zeros. So what about, kind of along the same vein then, automation? Since we're dealing with something a little bit more flexible and unwieldy.
Automation's IPv6's best friend.
Okay.
Is it really?
Yeah, the address space is so complex, right? If you look at what you're trying to do, it's so easy to fat finger an address.
Can we automate without regex though?
Well, actually, regex is actually really difficult in IPv6 to do proper regex streams for even understanding what an address is, just because of the zero compression, the leading zero compression, like all the stuff that goes on with v6. Just the practicality of it is it lends itself really well to automation, where computers don't make those sort of mistakes in regards to the address space. And so deployment becomes much more predictable. And if you have a good address plan, you're putting your variable components around the address in something that is well understood and hierarchical, then it makes it very easy for someone who's in the automation side to actually automate what needs to happen there. And if you're making good use of automation tools, deploying v6 should actually be easier, not harder, and more predictable and more accurate. So that's what we argue for. We don't think you should be deploying v6. I mean, your proof of concept lab, get down and dirty, hand type it, do all that stuff and learn. But the reality is at scale, when you're trying to use an automation tool to deploy v6, it just makes more sense. It's also easier to roll back if something does go wrong, right?
And the undo button.
Yeah, it's a lot easier. I'm flat out tell you, it's a lot easier to roll stuff back than not having that as a tool.
So how essential or how good of friends should I become with my IPAM or DDI vendor if I'm looking at an IPv6 transition?
Yeah, it's important to have a good strategy there, because a spreadsheet for IPv6 is just a disaster waiting to happen. It's just almost impossible to track everything that you want to do. And spreadsheets don't count in hexadecimal. So they don't increment naturally in hexadecimal. So going from, transitioning from the 0 through 9 and then going to A, B, C, D, E, F just isn't a thing that it does naturally anyway. And so you're better off with a tool that is purpose-built for solving that particular issue. And DHCP v6 is different enough from DHCP that you want something that knows the scope differences and the fact that your option codes are actually different between the two. And if you don't know that, you're going to make a mistake and you're not going to be happy. I think leveraging them is super important. And then if you want to get telemetry data, the IPAM side is super important. And that's also where you can get that additional information getting registered in the system about what's going on in the network. Yeah, super important. I'm not going to pitch one versus the other.
Sure. Yeah, not asking too.
But yeah, it's definitely a tool you want to use. It's super useful. It's super useful for IPv4 too. So don't get me wrong. Like, you should be using it for IPv4. It's not just an IPv6 thing for all the same reasons.
At some point earlier, Ed, you or Drew said something along the lines of kind of like related to project management. And Drew, we might need to do a whole episode on this because one of the things I've noticed is a lot of even very large organizations don't have project management for IT and security projects. Like it's more like just YOLO, here's what we need to do, figure it out to a team. And nobody's really helping those workflows and processes. But it sounds like definitely an IPv6 migration would be a great opportunity to maybe put some structure in place, get a plan together, bring in whoever, somebody, organization, education, tools, and have something methodically planned that's the central source of truth for all of the departments and teams that are going to be working on this. Instead of, I'm guessing, if one team is driving this, the others maybe begrudgingly
or being dragged along behind.
Yeah, they come along for the ride, being dragged by chains behind the carriage, maybe.
I think the important thing around the project management is many IT projects probably fit within a small sprint window, right? If you're doing an upgrade or something like that, they usually get away with doing a small, less than 3-month time interval for getting a project done. I think anything that extends past a year is very difficult for many organizations to manage. And a lot of security projects fit right within that, 9 months to greater than a year time frame. Especially if you're trying to do zero trust, you're probably looking at a 2-year time frame. How many project management teams actually know how to manage a project greater than a year in length? There's probably very few that actually know how to do that well. That's a skill. And so I would agree with you. There's a gap in the industry about being able to do long-term strategic planning for these sorts of things because you're going to have to survive people changing on projects, promotions, vendor changeouts or hardware changeouts. There's lots of things that are going to happen during the time duration that you have to move from point A to point B. And I'd say that most IT projects try and fit within a 3 to 6 month window to avoid those particular issues. It's an intentional thing by IT folks to avoid that. They also hate being managed. So that's true for every single IT person I've ever met. They hate being managed.
But if they can offload some of the documentation...
even then, they just won't produce the documentation. They don't care if someone's producing it or not because that's not high on the importance list. So they will literally do anything to avoid being managed by other people, both their direct manager and by a project manager who's saying that, this is important to the organization because they're often not organization aligned. This is the biggest problem I see with IT often is that they're not organization aligned for the business value. They're aligned around like, this is my skill set and expertise, and this is the most important thing that happens in this organization because this is what I work on.
Oh, Ed, you're opening a whole can of worms. I love this can of worms, but this is a can of worms. It's so true. We get so into our, whatever it is we're doing, that's the important thing. And we have no concept of the context of what our important thing is in the grand scheme of the organization we're doing it for.
Right.
Or even the team we're doing it for.
Isn't there a whole show on packet pushers for that?
There's a couple shows, yeah.
But yeah, that's an ongoing problem.
Technology is always a people problem eventually.
Yes, it really is. I think that's adoption for anything, security related, protocol related, net new technology related in terms of, whatever it is. It's usually a people problem and a culture problem first before it is a true technology hurdle problem. And there are a few exceptions to that, but definitely say that's the common thing that I run across. And the answer of no. Do you want to do this? No.
Oh, come on. The security is not always the department of no. Sometimes we say yes, and sometimes it's yes and or yes, but.
Sometimes it's no.
Yeah, sometimes it's no. Well, you know what? Part of the goal of our show, of our podcast, is to bridge security and networking and get everybody together, marching towards the same goal. But we're coming right up on time, and this has been a lot of great information. So, Ed, now you've authored books, you have podcasts, you do a lot of other stuff. You obviously do consulting. So if people are looking for you or for more information, where is the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, I guess LinkedIn. I mean, I'm technically on Twitter, but the only time I use Twitter is to repost the Packet Pushers IPv6 Buzz podcast recordings. I'm on Blue Sky too. You can find me on all of those, but LinkedIn is probably the best place. Obviously, you can listen to me on the IPv6 Buzz on the Packet Pushers. So that's a great way to reach out. So I am on the Slack channel for Packet Pushers, so you can hit me up directly if there's something that you have a burning question about IPv6. Go ahead and join and be happy to chat.
Well, Ed, you may regret that because, we'll have all these links in the show notes, including the packetpushers.net community where you can join that Slack and ask Ed all your questions.
I didn't say I'd answer them. I just said you could ask.
That's right.
I'm going over there right now. I've got questions.
Chuck it into the void. Well, Ed, thank you for joining us for this episode of Packet Protector. This was a really fun conversation. And JJ, I think we probably raised more questions than we answered, but I think we got a good start, hopefully.
We always do, don't we?
Yeah, we always do. But thank you, Ed. We really appreciate it. And thanks to you, the listener, for joining us and sticking around for this whole show. If there's a topic you want us to tackle, you can reach out to JJ or I at LinkedIn, or as that aforementioned Slack community, packetpushers.net/community. If you want to jump in there and talk to other IT folks about security, networking, IPv6, anything else that comes across your mind, it's a great community. Come and check it out. If you've got a comment, a correction, or a question, you can hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up, and we really do appreciate when listeners reach out and weigh in. And as always, make sure to eat your security vegetables.